Are we sure this is worth detouring for? If that planet really is on Earth's level of habitability, it needs to be documented. Captain Roderick, who'd made the final decision to divert towards the unknown planet, watched as their ship drew closer to the almost familiar blue and green orb. If they weren't several light years away, he'd swear it really was Earth. Even initial scans showed readings close to matching the home of humanity. Oxygen levels were breathable, temperature was livable, and there was a surprising abundance of water present. How hadn't the planet been charted yet? The ship eased down through the atmosphere and landed with a bump on solid ground. Captain Roderick selected 4 crew members for an exploration team, ordering the rest to keep busy on the ship. First was Tiana, a veteran science officer with shoulder-length brown hair and a permanently quizzical gaze. Second came Glenn, the navigator who never missed a chance to check out a new place. Heading up the rear was a medical officer named Pedro and another longtime crew member called Yuvi. They all stood behind their captain as the elevator lowered, dropping the 5 of them into the light of a brand new world. Captain Roderick immediately felt déjà vu. They were standing on grass, pure green grass that he thought was only from one place in the cold, dark universe, and that place was Earth. The rest of the crew was taking in the sight with similar amazement. Solid blue sky stretched above them, marred only by a few wavy white clouds, while on the ground, thick trees stretched into the distance of a landscape gorgeous enough to be a postcard. Light streamed in from a distant star, casting all the colors of an Earth sunset across the wilderness. "It's incredible!" Glenn exclaimed, taking in a deep breath. Tiana examined a square device in her hand. Temperatures are holding at around 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Atmospheric readings show oxygen levels at about 21%. Just like we saw on the ship, perfect living conditions for humans. "Look over there," Yuvi said, and the crew followed her finger to spot a lake close by. The 5 of them walked to the water's edge, and Captain Roderick crouched down to get a closer look. He found the liquid to be crystal clear, all the way down to a rock-filled bottom. Yuvi bent down as well, and with some hesitation, scooped a bit into her hand and let it drip through her fingers. It was water, all right. "It's clean, according to this," Tiana said as she tapped on her tablet. "Cleaner than some places on Earth, actually." Pedro grimaced. "Okay, but I don't have the meds to treat poisoning out here." "I'll try it first," Captain Roderick announced. He scooped a handful of water into his palm and raised it to his lips. His eyes widened as the liquid entered his mouth, instantly feeling more refreshed. Scooping up more, he swallowed several palms of it as Yuvi and Glenn joined in. The water was cool and perfect, reminding Roderick of an icy glass of lemonade in summer heat. Soon Glenn slipped into the water and started doing backstrokes. "Hey Pedro, come on in," he laughed. "I bet I'm a faster swimmer than you." "Thanks, I'll pass," Pedro chuckled. "But do let me know if you feel any parasites." After they had their fill, they started scanning the landscape. It was Yuvi who spotted a landmark through binoculars. "What's that tower in the distance?" she asked. The rest of them squinted. There, almost on the edge of the horizon, was a large cylindrical shape stretching up into the sky. None of them could see a top in the few wispy clouds surrounding it. "Guess we've got a direction now," Captain Roderick said. "Once we're ready, we'll head for that tower." Glenn, Pedro, and Yuvi returned to the elevator of the ship, where 5 backpacks of exploration supplies sat ready. Tiana pulled Captain Roderick aside before he could go for his own. There was a grave look on her face, one that the captain never liked to see. "Something's bothering me," she said, holding up her device so Roderick could take a look. On the screen was a black grid, with red outlines appearing as it passed over the crew members and a jumble of more as Tiana held it up to the ship. Then she turned around and scanned in a circle around her. The screen remained black. "There are no life forms other than us within 1,000 miles. No big creatures, no small critters, not even any insects in the ground," Tiana explained. Is that a problem? Roderick asked. Tiana's face remained serious. These readings show the perfect conditions for life, so why is there no life here? Roderick looked around at the Earth-like planet. No life anywhere? An eerie chill tickled his spine as he considered if venturing further out would be a good idea. You worry too much, Tiana, said Glenn, who'd heard her comments as he and his two companions returned with the supplies. If this place is empty, then we're the first to set foot on it. Maybe we'll get to name the planet and everything. That's all well and good, but look, if there's nothing out there, then nothing can attack us. Let's get on with this. Captain Roderick put a reassuring hand on Tiana's shoulder. Exploring is our job, after all. Tiana sighed and picked up her own bag of supplies, keeping her persistent worries to herself. So the five of them set out towards the distant structure, walking along a dirt path next to the lake. It twisted through a few patches of trees until an incline came, and the crew began to trek up a grassy hillside. They passed many beautiful sights reminiscent of Earth. A pristine waterfall cascaded down into a creek that ran towards the lake. Brilliantly colored wildflowers grew in large patches, untouched, but in perfect manicured rows without a single weed. Wild bushes with full, ripe crimson berries grew in droves all around, and after a taste test, proved to be just as juicy and satisfying as they appeared. Not one piece of technology or modern amenity, and yet the natural landscape was enough to impress each of the crew members. Tiana kept her tablet in hand, scanning and documenting everything. Pedro and Yuvi helped her by bagging samples of the dirt and plants for examining later. Glenn kept them heading north with his compass, the direction of the strange tower that was becoming closer as they walked along. Still the top remained invisible, and Captain Roderick began to wonder if it stretched all the way into space. They would know for sure when they reached the structure's foundation. Finally, they reached the top of the incline and decided to brake. Captain Roderick gazed back the way they came, seeing their distant ship had become the size of an acorn. Behind it on the horizon, the star mimicking the sun was starting to disappear, casting purple light across the sky. They'd come a long way. It's so quiet, Glenn commented. He was sitting next to his pack and had pulled out a protein bar. I could see this as another Earth colony. People would pay huge money to live in all this peace. This type of quiet is what drives folks insane, Pedro said. Yuvi was eyeing their destination with her binoculars. Structure is a weird shade of green. Honestly, it looks like the thing might be organic, like a big tree or something. At this point, I don't think we'll reach it before nightfall. She glanced back at Captain Roderick, who scratched his chin in thought. Nightfall was unpredictable. He wondered just how dark it would get without any light sources. Then again, it was nothing they hadn't prepared for. We've got lights with us. I see no reason not to continue, he said. Any signs of life yet, Tiana? She spun slowly in a circle with the device, then shook her head. Unease still clung to her face. Good, Roderick said. Then we best get moving. They pressed on. Eventually, the trees became sparse and changed into a large empty field atop the hill they'd climbed. By then, darkness had overtaken the planet, but up above hung an almost unfiltered view of the stars. Shining dots of all sizes covered the sky, except for a dark patch directly where their destination sat. They were close and would reach it within the hour. Then they'd finally find out just what it was. More they walked, each crew member bringing out large flashlights to guide the way. There in the field of grass, in the dark, the silence became an ever-present reminder of how far away the safety of the ship was. Captain Roderick had picked up the pace without realizing it, but none of his four companions questioned why. As they drew closer, the tower ahead revealed itself to be larger and larger until it was apparent the base covered miles of land. Their long journey ended feet from the structure. They were all weary and out of breath, but stood in awe of what lay before them. The width of the base stretched far to both directions, so much so that squinting was the only way to see the curvature of both sides, forming an almost cylindrical shape like a tree's trunk. Captain Roderick leaned his head back as far as he could. Still he couldn't make out where the thing ended upwards, but the strange, starless patch of sky hovered directly above. Yuvi's theory proved correct. The structure was indeed organic, merging with the ground as if it had grown from soil. Glenn stepped slowly forward with an outstretched hand. "Wait," Tiana said. "I don't think you should do that." "She's right, Glenn. You might disturb something in there," Captain Roderick threw in. "I'm just going to feel it," Glenn answered. His hand pressed against the green surface ever so lightly. Then he pressed a little harder. "It's cold," he announced. "The texture feels like a hard-shell fruit." He stepped down from the towering green obelisk, holding his hand out to Pedro so he could make sure nothing had clung to his skin. Pedro found no evidence of irritation. Yuvi, meanwhile, was staring up with her binoculars. "Pretty sure that dark patch wasn't this big an hour ago," she murmured. Captain Roderick looked up once more. She was right. Directly above them, the light of the stars had begun to blur and vanish further, like a large mass of clouds was expanding over them from wherever the structure's top was. The rest of the stars beyond its border remained vivid, making the growing dark spot even more obvious. "Captain," Tiana called. "I could be reading this wrong, but there are faint traces of life coming from this thing." She held up her device. Sure enough, as she aimed it at the structure, dots of red and orange flickered across the screen. "It's inconsistent, which might mean a glitch or a misread, but it's the first reading we've seen on the planet. What should we do?" Captain Roderick sighed. All coming to the structure had done was make more questions than answers. He almost wished they'd never landed there in the first place, but now that they had, it was his duty to document everything and bring it back to his superiors for study. An undiscovered planet able to support life was not something he could overlook. The captain's guidebook referred to those places as Terrestrial Domain. All right. Here's what we're going to do," Roderick began. "First, I'm going to contact the ship. Then we're going to set up lights and gather as much data as we can. Since I really don't want to stumble back towards the ship in the dark, we'll make camp for a few hours when we're done. We can head back when it starts to get light again." "We're going to sleep here?" Tiana questioned. She didn't like the thought of being unconscious on an unknown planet. "Just for a few hours. We'll take turns keeping watch. Sound good?" Glenn, Pedro, and Yuvi nodded their heads. Tiana hesitated, but eventually nodded as well. In no time there was a camp set up, with 4 stick lights illuminating the small area. Their work was quick and calculated, collecting more dirt samples and scanning every inch of the green tower. None, however, had any luck in cutting a sample from the dense bark. They jotted notes. They tested data. The job was routine to them, and soon enough the crew of 5 was crawling into sleeping bags as Captain Roderick dimmed the lights. "Just think," Glenn was saying. "If they turn this planet into a new colony, our names are going in the history books as the ones who discovered it. Hell, I might even consider settling down here. It's almost better than Earth." "The whole thing has to be charted first, or at least a good amount of it. Hopefully all these natural resources aren't exclusive to the area," Pedro said. "Well, there's no questioning how perfect of a find it is, and how we're here first is beyond me. Can't believe we just happen to be passing by." "Doesn't it seem a little too perfect?" All 4 heads turned toward Tiana. She was lying on her back in the sleeping bag, staring straight up at the sky. "What do you mean?" Yuvi asked from the spot where she lay. "I mean, perfect oxygen levels, perfect temperature, perfect everything for life, yet it's nowhere on any charts and there's nobody and nothing here. Hundreds of ships just like ours pass through this sector of space every week, but somehow we found it without even having to search. None of this makes any sense." Glenn scoffed. "Get off it, Tiana. Everybody gets lucky once in a while. That's how every new planet was found." Tiana said nothing. The green structure loomed over them, an unending tower that would watch over them as they slept. One by one, they all nodded off, until Tiana was the sole person awake, taking the first shift of the night watch. Her eyes burned as she stared at her tablet screen. Over and over she browsed what they'd collected, trying to solve a problem that might not have existed. Time started to melt away. Captain Roderick knew something was wrong the second he opened his eyes. It was still dark, but something about the atmosphere had changed. A new heat was present, like the kind that came from standing near an exhaust-filled highway, feeling the breath of 100 working engines. He sat up. The sky had changed as well. The dark mass, which a few hours ago had only covered a small area above the structure, was blanketing a majority of the atmosphere in a huge shadow. "Captain," Tiana said. He turned towards her. Tears were pouring down her face, and her hands lay quivering at her side. She put on a weak smile. "I think I figured it all out." Roderick got to his feet, and his heart began to pound. She was scaring him. "What are you talking about?" "Have you heard of an anglerfish?" Tiana asked, her voice void of emotion. "You don't seem well. An anglerfish lives deep in Earth's oceans. It's an ugly-looking creature that lures its prey in with a light attached to a fin on its forehead. Can you imagine being a fish, swimming along in the dark, when you see a beacon of light in the distance? It's so beautiful, so perfect, that an unconscious attraction makes you swim right to it. By the time you realize you've been baited into a trap, the anglerfish snaps you up in its jaws." "Science Officer Tiana, I think we need to get you back to the ship for a checkup." She shook her head. With her right hand, she picked up the device and held it up above her head. "Nowhere we go will change the truth. See for yourself." He looked and did see. On the screen, showing right above them, was a life form reading. A bigger one than Roderick had ever seen, the gargantuan red blob almost covering the entire screen. As realization clicked into his mind, he felt a subtle rumbling from beneath his feet. The tower that they'd walked so far to reach was moving. It stretched and tugged in the ground like something was pulling it upwards from the sky, pulling the whole planet towards something big. Roderick broke from his trance and whipped his body over to raise his sleeping crewmates, but Tiana grabbed his wrist. "Don't wake them. It's too late. It was too late the second we landed on this planet." Captain Roderick watched as the shadows seemed to move closer to the ground, growing more and more solid as the towering green structure swayed. Shimmers began to form on the edges of the mass, in several layers that resembled stars. Rows of sharp mountains used to devour food that the entire crew was about to become. The promise of a new colony for humanity faded as the perfect planet to support life, which had done its job as a lure, edged closer to the unfathomable thing it was attached to. The stars were blotted out by a planet-sized set of jaws hurtling towards the surface. Roderick wondered, in those last few moments, if that planet of doom would be just as beautiful for the next crew who landed on it thinking they'd just made the discovery of a lifetime. Then the jaws snapped shut and everything went black. Hey there, this is Matt Aldrich, and thanks for making it to the end of the story. If you like that one, I invite you to check out the first already on the channel, and subscribe for more. The next story isn't far off. For more updates, give me a follow on Twitter, @AldrichLives, link in the description. Until next time, my friends, try not to think about what might be lurking out there in space for too long before bed, alright? Good night.